What is happening and what is up? Hold out your glass, because we're about to fill it up.
All things continually lead back to serpents, dragons, fairies, Nephilim, and fallen angels.
In the distance looms a mystical mountain.
As Mike Heiser used to say, if it's in the Bible and it's weird, it's probably important.
At its peak, a great fire burns, concealing the Prometheus lens.
This development of this knowledge that's being talked about within the mystery schools.
An ancient artifact said to reveal the hidden truth within a deliberately darkened world.
There is a hidden history that's been deliberately obfuscated from the peoples of the world.
Join us as we travel and explore the vast unknown. It's a hero's journey with dragons to slay, damsels to save, and innumerable treasures to hoard. Torches high.
The Smithsonian, they caught wind of a giant skeleton. They would send their agents out to get it.
But it takes courage to move forward, to move out of the shadows, out of the unreality that we think of as reality.
We are all on the hero's journey.
Mankind has been in contact with and influenced by extraterrestrials.
Leave the Sitchin mound of bull feathers out of it.
You know, look at it from a different perspective.
What is happening and what is up? Hold out your glass, because we are about to fill it up. Welcome to the Prometheus Lens Podcast, the place where the conversations are always enlightening. I'm your host, Justin, and here we like to use the allegory of the Prometheus Lens to take a second look at everything. Guys, if you're new to the channel, welcome to the hero's journey. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We'll have the socials coming down below. Be sure to check those out on our various platforms. It'd be much appreciated. Man, today, one of those just iconic moments for me, and a constant reminder of I just love doing what I do. I get to talk to just brilliant people every single day and expand my knowledge, and I think it's just a privilege to talk to these people. But have a great treat for you guys today. We have an Egyptologist that has turning the world upside down. This man has looked at the chronology of Egypt, and you probably know him from his works and books and lectures, and recently the patterns of evidence. But I'd like to welcome to the show David Rohl. David, thank you so much, sir, for taking the time to talk to me.
It's great to be with you, Justin.
Well, for those that are just not familiar with you, just give us a little background and a little information on you.
Okay, well, I'll have to start when I was quite young then in that case, because I began writing Egyptian hieroglyphs at the age of 7. I don't know why, I haven't got a clue, but there I was writing all the names of the Egyptian kings in hieroglyphs and in Greek and also in English, you know, the pharaohs. And I haven't got a clue why that happened. And then I went to Egypt for the first time at the age of 9. I sailed from Cairo all the way to Abu Simbel in King Farouk's paddle steamer. He was the king of Egypt that was thrown out in the revolution there. And I even slept in his bed. I hasten to add he wasn't in the bed at the time. He was over in Italy. And it was a magical experience for me at the age of 9 to do that. And I've been interested in Egyptology ever since, although I did have an intermission. I was in the rock industry for quite a few years. At 15, I formed my first band, and I became a studio engineer and then a record producer, working with George Martin, who was the Beatles producer. And then eventually, after about 20 years in the industry, I decided I'd had enough music. I was going half deaf anyway from all the studio work. And I went back to university for a second time to study Egyptology and ancient history and Levantine archaeology and Greek Mycenaean archaeology, Anatolian archaeology, that's modern Turkey, doing all those different disciplines. So I regard myself basically as an archaeologist historian. Some people would say ancient historian, but I don't like that term because it makes me feel very old. But I also write books. I've had bestsellers all around the world, and I also presented TV series as well on my theories. So I've got a pretty wide experience in different industries and different ways of thinking, which I think helps when you're dealing with something like chronology. If you've been in the rock industry, which is a hard industry to actually live in and exist in, you're pretty good at doing other things then. When you go to university as a mature student, which I was at the time, you think like a mature student, but you also think with a good mind as well, because being in the music industry, you have to be sharp.
Mm. Well, most definitely, and that's one of the things that really attracted me to you, because you're not someone that was that came in and went to school your whole life this way, and it's kind of like Campbell says, it's the hero's journey. You got to be willing to play the fool to be the wise old man. I love it.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's true. When I was at university for the second time as a mature student, I think I was about 37 at the time, my professors said they really liked me being in the class because I had a mature attitude towards things and wasn't like the young things that my other fellow students were all 18 and 19 years old. And they were too scared to ask the professors anything, but I wasn't. Mm-hmm. I was raring to go, and they enjoyed that intellectual discourse, which they didn't get from the average student who was too young really to get, to impress new ideas on them. So, we had a very interesting relationship, I think.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, because at that point, it's like, you're at that young age, you're developing who you are, your character, and you're, you don't want to challenge the authority and stuff.
That's right. Well, that's exactly it. And sadly, in the history of disciplines, that more than anywhere else, it's the young ones that end up succeeding the professors. So they cling to the professor's coattails throughout their careers, never saying boo to a goose. And so they become the next professor in the department, and they haven't learned anything new because all they've learned is what their professor told them. And he was a professor who was learning off a previous professor. So you have to bring new blood in, new ideas in. I think otherwise history becomes stagnant.
Yeah. Well said. That's what I tell people with this. It's healthy to listen to people, but you need to look into things yourself and question everything, re-examine everything. But
that's very true. But you have to be trained. That's very important to say as well. University is a great school. It teaches you the methodologies of how to reference material, how to read material, how to understand material. And the methodologies are very important when you go into a difficult subject like chronology and ancient history. So, people who come into the business without that training, they fall flat sometimes because they don't have the training and they don't have the necessary tools to understand what they're reading.
Yep. I agree. Foundations are definitely important. Well, give us, I was wanting to go through Egypt with you and kind of go through the chronology and how you stumbled across these things, and also just kind of go through that and touch on the patterns of evidence, because I thought it was fascinating, just the whole subject of Joseph and the history of the Bible tying in with Egypt.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I didn't come into the whole thing wanting to prove the Bible. I mean, I'm what we would call an agnostic. And what I mean by that is somebody who's still on the road, doesn't quite know where to go yet. And it's quite a stony road. So I'm not an atheist by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm not fully committed, although my personal views about the New Testament are that Jesus was a most astonishing individual and the most brilliant individual. And I try to follow his teachings as much as I can. But when it comes to the Old Testament, I look at the archaeology, I look at the historical aspects of it and what we can learn from it. So when it comes to the sort of work I do, I read other academic works. Obviously, your foundation is what other people in the past have written about a subject. And I came across a book in the 1960s and early 70s by Professor Kenneth Kitchen, who is an evangelical Christian, but he's also an Egyptologist, very famous one. And he was the grand master, if you like, of chronology of the ancient world, especially Egyptian chronology. And this book was an astonishing book. It was only a little blue book. It was quite thick. But it was basically bringing together all the information that we have about a very obscure period in Egyptian history. Now, Egyptian history is divided up into kingdom periods. So you have you have the pre-dynastic period before Egypt really gets going. And then you have the Old Kingdom, which is the Pyramid Age, of Khufu and Giza and all the rest of it. Then you have something called an intermediate period, which is most strange word, I know, but it's a period when society collapses and the kingdom is no longer unified along the whole of the River Nile. So that's called the first intermediate period. And there are several minor kings ruling in different parts of the country, basically, along that river. And then you have the Middle Kingdom, and that's when, again, the country is unified under one ruler, a series of rulers, but then there's one pharaoh ruling at the same time, no other pharaohs. And then you have a second intermediate period, which is a period of collapse again. And then you have the New Kingdom. And New Kingdom's the famous one. That's the one where you have Tutankhamun and Ramesses II and all those great pharaohs. And then we hit something called the third intermediate period. And that was the one that fascinated me because it's very long. It's very complicated. It's dynasties 21 to 25, and it's a real mess. And when I was at university, we weren't taught it. The professors jumped from the end of the New Kingdom to what we call the late period, and they ignored this era completely because it was a quagmire, and they didn't understand it themselves. So
like
that's
Genesis
why
6 in the church.
Yeah, so
that's
now
weird.
Now I was interested because that's something that was a challenge, and I like challenges. So that got me really excited. Now, this book by Professor Kenneth Kitchen was basically an analysis of all the material from that period, from Dynasty 21 to 25. The first time it had ever been put together in a single volume. And that was a brilliant piece of work. But then he tried to sort of sort out the chronology of it. You try to establish a dating system for the whole period. And it's a period where the dynasties are overlapping each other. There's a multiplicity of different pharaohs. And it's very, very complicated. And there was myself and a number of other PhD students at university who, when they got this book, realized that it wasn't constructed the way it should have been. The data was all there, but his reconstruction of the chronology we felt was wrong, was misplaced. And that's where it all began, really. And we tried to first of all, we broke it down, the elements of it down, to try and reconstruct the brickwork of it again. And then we tried to rebuild the chronology. And what we found was that this third intermediate period had been artificially extended. And what that means is if you think about going backwards in time, so you come first of all to the 25th dynasty and you go all the way back to the 21st dynasty, what Egyptologists had done had stretched the timeline out too far. So the 21st dynasty had gone far too far into the past, basically. In other words, we felt it could be Constantine had brought to a much shorter period of time. Now, what that affects is every other dynasty that came before it, the dates will come down towards the present because you're shortening the third intermediate period. It's like an elastic band. You release it a little bit and everything that comes before it will come down in time. Okay. Now, that has huge implications because the ancient Egyptian chronology is what we use to actually date all the other civilizations around the Middle East, including Israel's archaeology, including the Mycenaean Greeks, including the Hittites, including the Minoans. They're all dated because we find artifacts with Egyptian hieroglyphs in them, like kings' names, in those sites around the Middle East. So when we dig a level, let's say at Megiddo or somewhere, and we find a cartouche of Ramesses II on a scarab or on an object, we date that level to Ramesses II, and therefore we give the dates that the Egyptologists have given to Ramesses II to that level. So you see how it's all tied together. Now, when it comes to the Holy Land, when it comes to what we call the Levant, archaeology people call it the Levant, obviously, if you've got Egyptian dating the different levels, then that's where you expect to find the biblical story. But we don't find it. We don't find it there at all. In fact, most of the Egyptologists and archaeologists will say, well, we don't have any evidence for the Bible until we get to around about 800 and something, the time of Ahab. So anything before that is fiction. None of it is true. None of it is reliable. Why? Because that third intermediate period has been stretched so far back, it's disjointed the relationship between the Bible story and the archaeology of the Holy Land and Egypt, which dates the archaeology. And I know that's a complicated thing to try to explain to you, but that's basically where the problem is. The reason why most academics say the Bible is a work of pious fiction is because they can't find the archaeology in their time frame to match the biblical story. But once you get this thing called the new chronology, which is where you have this adjustment of the third intermediate period and lower the dates, then it all synchronizes together. And we do start to find archaeological evidence for the different stories in the Bible.
Yeah, and,
Now,
and
that
as
was
I was
that.
listening to
Go
your
on.
lectures, that's what blew my mind. Is like, it's kind of like Indiana Jones, where he said, they're digging in the wrong place. They're looking
Yeah.
in the wrong time.
Yeah, well, when I was younger, in the 1990s, I actually called the real Indiana Jones in the Sunday Times Color Supplement magazine front cover, which was a bit embarrassing, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, archaeology is not like you see in the movies. It's completely different. And it's basically hard work. But at the end of the day, an archaeologist produces the evidence, but it's then the historian who interprets that evidence. So you have to have a foot in each discipline. You have to have one in archaeology and one in ancient history, because you've got to use your brain to work out what that archaeology is telling you.
Are you a hunter or hiker or prepper, or just someone who enjoys the great outdoors? Whichever case that may be, Squatch Survival Gear has you covered. Not only is this a veteran-owned company, all of the products are 100% made in America, baby. All the way down to the fabric and every stitch. So whether it's a day hike, a weekend getaway, or the ultimate bug out bag, head on over to squatchsurvivalgear.com and use the code PLP10 for 10% off store-wide. Are you a member of the All Access Pass yet? If not, what are you waiting for? Join the band of brothers and sisters on this hero's journey. The members community page gets you access to the private community, monthly members chats, and guest Q&As. Also gets you 48-hour early access to all episodes for just $5 a month. The All Access Pass gets you all that, plus exclusive members only episodes for just $10 a month. If you enjoy the content, this is your way to ensure I get to keep doing this show. This is your way as a listener to sponsor the show. So head on over to PrometheusLensPodcast.com and sign up. All right, guys, back to the episode. Yeah, and that's one thing too. When I was listening to one of your lectures and you were talking about how it's all circular reasoning.
Yeah.
They use the Bible to confirm the Egypt timeline.
Yep.
But then it comes back around and they're like, well, then the Bible's fiction because it doesn't line up with our timeline over here.
It's a beautiful piece of circular reasoning, which I'll explain as easy as I can. It's a complicated business, but in the Bible, the very first time we hear the name of a pharaoh in the Bible, he's called Shishak, okay, or Shishak. And before that, in the Bible, it just refers to Pharaoh. It never gives a name, right? Well, Champollion thought this name Shishak belonged to a Pharaoh who was founded the 22nd dynasty in this third intermediate period I was telling you about. And it's the second dynasty of that period, who's called Shoshenq I. And so what they did was they dated Shoshenq I because they thought he was Shishak to the mention in the Bible, because it says that he plundered the Temple of Solomon in year 5 of King Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon. And we know what date that was. That's 925 BC, according to the biblical chronology. So they dated Shoshenq I to 925 BC. So they're using the Bible to date the 22nd dynasty and this king, okay? Then they calculate backwards in time, working their way back to the 19th dynasty where Ramesses II is sitting at that point, and they calculate all the lengths of the different reigns, and then they say, okay, well, it says in the Bible that the Israelites built the city of Ramses. The slaves did, okay? So this must be Ramesses II, the most famous Ramesses of all the pharaonic kings, and say, okay, well, that means we must date the story of the slaves building the city, and therefore Moses and the Exodus, we must date it to the time of Ramesses II. But when you look at the archaeology, there's nothing. There are no Israelites in Egypt at that time. There are no Semitic peoples in Egypt at that time. Not a huge population. We get the idea from the Bible. And then when you go to someone like Jericho, well, it didn't exist in that time. It was a ruin. So 40 years after the Exodus, when Joshua comes along and destroys the city of Jericho, the walls fall down, and it's abandoned for 600 years, well, there's no city there for Joshua to destroy. So they say, okay, that means Joshua's fiction. The destruction's fiction, and therefore, if we look back a little bit further, Moses is fiction, the Israelites were never in Egypt, and therefore the Bible's a load of nonsense. But they use the Bible to date Ramesses in the first place, and then they use Ramesses and the archaeology to say, well, the Bible is a load of nonsense.
Yeah.
Silly, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And I love how you broke down that name and how they found a tablet in ancient Anatolia.
Yeah.
And tied in who this pharaoh actually was that plundered the temple and took the treasures. Hey, if you're tuning in every single week, then that means you enjoyed the content. But did you know that there's an all-access pass for less than one stop at McDonald's? It can get you a month's worth of members-only episodes, access to a private community of like-minded brothers and sisters. This also gives you a monthly Q&A with authors and speakers and guests that we've had on the show. And not only is this just all for you, you are also helping to ensure that I keep doing this show each and every single week. I know lots of people that support podcasts that if you stopped subscribing, they'd never even know you were gone because they don't need your money. They don't need your funds. I'm a working class guy, 9 to 5, just like the rest of you. So not only am I working 40 plus hours a week, I'm coming home, reading, studying, doing interviews, cutting these videos, and giving you guys some great infotainment. So if you enjoy the content, hey, help me out with a cheeseburger or a Happy Meal once a month, and you will see every bit of that get reinvested into this show and things that will just filter straight back to you, the listener. I would love to be doing this full time, but if you're enjoying the content at the level that I'm producing now, you can imagine the level and volume of content that I'd produce if this was my full-time ministry. So thank you for the love and support and the views that I get. I'm averaging right now 13 to 15,000 downloads a month. So if any of you guys feel compelled, hey, sign up and join us on the hero's journey and get the all access pass. Because not only do you get 48-hour early access, you get monthly members chats and Q&As, access to the private community, members only exclusive content. You are also helping to ensure that I keep doing what you are enjoying. So head on over to PrometheusLensPodcast.com, follow the members link, and I'll see you guys on the other side.
Well, yeah, you know your stuff here. You've been reading a lot. I can see that. Okay, so yeah, that's interesting. Ramesses, and that's a name that we give the king. His full title is Usamatre Setepen Re Ramesses Meri Amun. That's what when we read his titles, but that's Egypto speak. It's how scholars pronounce it, so we can communicate with each other. Okay, but when we have a peace treaty in the time of Ramesses II, where we have a hieroglyphic version on the walls of Karnak, and we have a little tablet in the city of the Hittites, so at Hattusha, where they found this tablet, which is a copy of a peace treaty. So you have a peace treaty written out in both cuneiform, which is the lingua franca and script of the Mesopotamia and that area, and including the Hittites, and you have Egyptian hieroglyphs, and you compare the two together. On the Egyptian one, we would say Usamatre Ramesses Setepen Re, etc., etc. But on the cuneiform one, where the scribes are listening to the name of Ramesses as they're writing their document, these diplomats who've drawn up the peace treaty, they're listening to the way they hear the name of King Ramesses. He's not called that. He's called Washmuria Shatetmaria Masheshimiamana. Now you try saying that when you've had a few pints. So the name Ramesses is actually Riamashisha. That's how it was heard and how it's pronounced. Okay. Now it just so happens, like you have in modern times, that ancient pharaohs had short forms to their names. They call them hypochoristicons. It's a posh name for it. It just means a short version of your name. So I will say Edward would be Ed. All right. You might be called just by one or two people. I don't know, your mates or whatever. You've got a fairly short one. People might call me Dave. I'll hit them if they do, but I'm a David, not a Dave. Okay. And Lady Di would be Diana, etc. So we've all got these what we call hypochoristicons or short form names. Well, Ramesses had one too. And he was known by this because nobody wants to say Washmuria Shatetmaria Riamasheshimiamana every time they want to speak about him. So they called him Shisha, which is from Riamashisha. So the last bit, they took that little bit and they said, King Shisha. Okay. And then the Bible hears it as Shishak. And so they say, well, this guy, Shishak, plunder the Temple of Solomon, but it's actually Ramesses II who did that. So Ramesses II is not the pharaoh that you see Yul Brynner in the Ten Commandments. Ramesses is not the pharaoh of the Exodus at all. There's no evidence of that. He's in fact Shishak of the Bible. Okay, so then you have to look for the Exodus much, much earlier in time, well before the 19th dynasty. And then you start to see the goodies turn up, because then you start to see the real evidence for the stories in the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, that just opens up the whole door. And when I heard your lecture on that, I was like, man, that is just amazing. And then you get to the mention of the city of Ramses. And of course, a lot of people miss that these texts were written looking back.
Yes, so that's a good way to put it. Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. Yeah,
they're going to use words and names of cities that are recognizable to the people of that time.
Correct. So it's the place they're talking about, not necessarily the name. So when they talk about the Israelites built slaves building the city of Ramses, what they're referring to is the city that's underneath Ramses. Because in the time when that bit was written down, it's probably in the time of Josiah, they would have known it as Ramses or Ramesses, yeah? But in fact, there's another city underneath called Avaris, and that's the actual one that the Israelites were in. Because in the city of Ramses, we don't see any Semitic peoples, we don't see any Hebrews. You go back much, much earlier to the city of Avaris, and the entire population are Israelites, are Semitic peoples. And what happens to them? Well, they suddenly disappear from the place. They pack up and leave. They disappear and they wander off and nobody knows where they went. Well, we know where they went. They went out into Sinai, didn't they? And then they turned up in the Holy Land, the Promised Land. But that's all there in the archaeology from that period, but it isn't there in the time of Ramesses II.
Yeah, but once again, I mean, the chronology, they're looking in the wrong time.
Exactly.
And another example,
in the right place, but in the wrong time.
Right.
Yeah.
And another example I tell people too is in the book of Genesis, where you get the War of the Five Kings and these giant clans. It mentions Amalek or the Amalekites.
Yeah, Amalekites.
Well, that's before Amalek was even born in the chronology. Because it was written looking back. These were actually, it was talking about the Horites who the Edomites interbred with.
They're the Hurrians. Horites are Hurrians, exactly. Yeah, so once you've reduced the third intermediate period down to a proper length of time and everything else is sliding down, now we've got these things synchronizing together, locking together. So we can now, the obvious thing to do here, I don't understand why archaeologists don't think this way, but it's okay. Well, if there was no Jericho in the time of Ramesses II, when was there a Jericho? When was it destroyed? Oh, we know that. We know where the city is. We've always known where the city is. It's not a mystery as to where Jericho is. It's Tel Es Sultan in the Jordan Valley. All the tourists go to see it, etc. So when was it destroyed? Because that will be when the Israelites conquered the place. And it was abandoned for 600 years after that. So that's why it doesn't appear in the time of Ramesses II, because it's in that 600-year period where there was nothing going on there. It's just a ruin. Okay, so if you look at the city that was destroyed, it's the one at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Now, I haven't explained Bronze Ages to you, but basically Ramesses II is late Bronze Age. Okay, so if you have to go back in time again to the Middle Bronze Age, that is the equivalent of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, the 12th dynasty, and the 13th dynasty. And then we get what we call the second intermediate period, which is the Hyksos period. That's the time when Jericho thrived as a city with about 2,000 people living there, and it had a circuit wall around it made of mud bricks, and a rampart we call a glacis, a fortification system that actually meant there was a slope going up to the top of the ramp, and then there was a great big mud brick wall on top. And when the archaeologists excavated, they found that mud brick wall had fallen down the slope and come to the bottom of the slope. So the walls had fallen down, and the Israelites were able to enter the city. And then when they excavated the dwellings inside the city, they found that they were all burnt to the ground. That's again what the story of Joshua tells us. So that's the one that Joshua destroyed. And once we pin that down as to when it is, which is in the late Middle Bronze Age, the last part of the Middle Bronze Age, we can look back to Egypt 40 years earlier, and we see this huge population of Semites living in the land of Goshen in the Eastern Delta. And they disappear from that place. They just go off in a puff of smoke. And 40 years later, Jericho's destroyed. Well, that's the story in the Bible. Come on, folks. Why aren't they looking at the obvious evidence?
I mean, because it's honestly, I've always seen it as they do not want it to be true. And they will jump through hoops and dodge things just to purposefully try to disprove and shut down this book.
It's more about reputations in academia, really. If you spent your life trying to explain away the anomalies, the problems of history, and especially the Dark Age of Greece, for instance, which is also affected by this whole revision, right? And you write books about it, and you're the leading authority on it, or you're Kenneth Kitchen, who's written this wonderful work, and he believes that Ramesses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus, although there's no actual archaeology for that. Then their reputations are at stake. If I come along and say, and my mates come along and say, "I'm sorry, you got it all wrong. Let's knock it all down and start again," they're not going to do that. They're going to resist. Because it's their reputations are at stake, and so they're going to resist it, especially in the history disciplines, because they're always looking backwards. You don't look forward in history, you always look backwards. So basically, it's more about reputations, really, and it's very, very hard to persuade people to change their lifetime view of something. So, I mean, you look at something like continental drift, that whole theory, when it was first put together, that the Americas had separated from the African continent. Everybody said that was complete lunacy, and nobody believed it at all. And it took about 25 years before it began to be accepted. And now, of course, it's science. It's what people say happened, So you have to fight these things, and I'll probably be long dead before it ever gets accepted. What I'm proposing, to be honest.
Yeah, it does. It takes a long time. I mean, look at Professor Carl Ruck with the whole the Greek and the using of antigens and things like that in the different cultures and things like that. It took him, he'd come out with that in the 70s, and it's just now coming around to academia, saying that he was right.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I mean, you basically, in my situation, and many other people, and I mean, there are a lot of scholars on this new chronology thing now, especially young ones, but they get classed with all the, what I would call the loonies as well, I know you look into stuff like that as well, but basically, we're not. We're trained. We're university people, we're PhD people, we're scholars, but, and we're of a different generation to the ones who resist us. And so we've got the training. They can't dismiss us the same way, but they try. They do try to do that. They do try to say, well, they don't know what they're talking about. They're all crazies. But the trouble is, gradually and slowly, people are beginning to accept it. And especially, I would call the lay public, because they see the common sense of it. They see that it does make sense. And that's where the patterns of evidence thing came in, because, people saw it for the first time there, probably. They probably weren't aware of my writings and all the rest of it and my research. And they saw it there for the first time, especially in America. And they said, well, hang on a minute. Why haven't the scholars seen this as obvious before? And so we've got a large following within the evangelical and Christian communities, as well as outside that, who believe that the common sense prevails here. But the academics are still resisting, essentially.
Yeah. And they even attack your character. I remember there was a gentleman that they allowed you to play the patterns of evidence at a high-profile college, but under the circumstance that you couldn't be there to defend the issue, so they could tear it down without your defense. And they put up a picture of you as a rock star and said, is this who you want to get your chronology from?
Exactly. I was not invited. And they didn't want me. They didn't want to debate. They just wanted to make their statements. And as you say, they used my music industry history to denigrate my archaeological work, basically, and scholarship. Whereas people who know me, especially my professors and others who know me within the disciplines, they have a very different view of me. They respect my ideas. They don't necessarily agree with them. I'm not saying they agree with them now, but they realize it's good scholarship. And so there's a debate going on. And when you have an evangelical college, very famous one, basically having one side of the story and telling their audience and their students that you mustn't listen to this guy because he's a rock star, well, that's really silly. That's a stupid attitude.
Disingenuous.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, with this new chronology and the way everything lines up, could you go into some of the discoveries at Avaris and who actually you believe was the pharaoh of the Exodus?
Okay, shall we start with Joseph then? Because if we go in, we'll instead of going backwards in time, let's go forwards in time now from what we see at the beginning of that city, that settlement. So I explained that underneath the city of Ramses is this big city called Avaris. Well, it was one of the biggest cities in the ancient world, but it had very, very small beginnings. So in the late 12th dynasty, which is part of this Middle Kingdom thing, there was a very famous pharaoh called Amenemhat III. And he reigned for a long, long time. And in his time, when he was king on the throne of Egypt, this little settlement formed in the Eastern Delta in what we call Goshen in the Bible. And it was about, I don't know, 12 or 15 houses altogether made of mud brick with a central large house, which seems to be the clan leader of this group of people. Now, they were all Semitic peoples. They'd come from the north. They'd come down through what we call the Levant, through Canaan, and they settled in Egypt. And they were the first people in this particular location next to the River Nile. And this house that is at the center of the community there is a typical house that we find in northern Syria, which, of course, is where the patriarchs came from. So it's the same style of house. It later evolves into what we call the four-roomed house, which we see in Israel all over the place. It's the same principal design. Anyway, over a period of time, this house is demolished, and then we have a much bigger palace built on the top of it. Okay, so we have what looks like an Egyptian palace, but we know from the artifacts found there and the graveyard behind the palace that the people who lived in this palace were Semitic. They were Semites. And if you want to call them Hebrews, you can call them Hebrews. You can even call them Israelites if you want to go that far. Now, this palace was for an Egyptian official of Semitic origins. He was a really big wig, but he wasn't Egyptian. Why do I know that? Well, because he had a tomb in the back garden. Okay, and this tomb was a pyramid tomb. Now, in this period, in the 12th dynasty, nobody had pyramids apart from pharaohs. So what's this guy doing who wasn't a pharaoh, and he was a Semitic guy? What was he doing having a pyramid tomb built for him? Well, that's because he was the most high-ranking person in the land, and he was awarded by Pharaoh with this special tomb that nobody else could have. Okay, so so how do I know he's a Semite? Well, on the front of this pyramid was a chapel built onto it for people to come and put offerings in the chapel or whatever to the deceased who was buried in the pyramid. All right. Now, what were they? They had a statue in this chapel. It's about twice life size, seated statue. So if you were standing in front of it, the head of the statue would be above you. You couldn't, it'll be above your head standing there. Big statue. And the fragments of it that were found, it wasn't all found, the fragments of it that were found were very interesting. The head was there. Now, the head had been attacked with an axe. Somebody tried to smash it to smithereens all along the skull surface here. The body of the thing below the chest had disappeared. Somebody had removed that away. But what we found out from the forehead of this head was that it had been painted with yellow skin. Now, that's not how Egyptians portrayed themselves. That when you have a yellow skin painting on something, on a wall painting or on a statue, it means somebody from the north, a Semitic person. Okay. And the guy had flame red hair. Now, that ain't an Egyptian thing either. There's no way any Egyptians had red hair like that. And it was beautifully combed. And like the statue was like really a beautiful quality statue. And then he had on his shoulder here, he had a throw stick across his shoulder like this. Now, a throw stick is like a boomerang, and it was used in the area of where the Semitic peoples were for hunting. So that was like a symbol saying this scepter of office that I have, because I'm a high official, tells everybody that I'm an Asiatic, I'm a Semite. Okay, so I thought, oh God, this is looking interesting. We've got this palace here in this city of Avaris, okay, and we've got this pyramid tomb which shouldn't be there. Okay, and what they did was they dug down into the burial chamber behind the chapel, okay, because the burial chamber was underneath the pyramid. It was like a mud brick dome structure. And as they were digging down, they found that somebody had already entered the tomb. There was a tunnel. And so they went through the tunnel and when they got into the tomb itself, it was completely empty. There was nothing in it. Okay, so people say, okay, robber's tunnel. Everything must have been plundered. All right, well, okay, so why is there no skeleton? Okay, why is there no broken pottery? Why is there no mummy beads? You know, they don't nick those. Those are not the things you take out of a tomb if you're robbing it. And it's very clear that the tomb was entered not long after the burial, maybe 50 years, 100 years, something like that later than the deceased person was placed in there. So it matches the story of Joseph, because Joseph, who was a great vizier, who lived in a palace somewhere, and we now know where, in the land of Goshen, where his family were and his tribe were. And he must have been honored by the Pharaoh to have this wonderful palace and then this pyramid tomb. And then what happens when Moses takes the Israelites out of Egypt? He goes into the tomb of Joseph, and he takes the coffin out and he takes it with him on the journey to the Promised Land. And Joseph is then buried in a place called Shechem in northern Israel, right? But what I haven't told you is on the back of the statue, because the statue was, as I said, was fragments, but it still had paint on it. On the back shoulder of the statue, there were multicolored stripes from a coat of many colors.
Mm.
So how much evidence do you want to show that we have the archaeology for the time of Joseph in Avaris, in the land of Goshen, with his Egyptian palace, because he was Egyptianized, which incidentally had 2 apartments on it, built onto it, which were for his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. They both had equal apartments built onto the front of it. And he had a pyramid tomb with a multicolored statue coat on it, and then his body was removed and disappeared. What's that if it's not the story of Joseph's life?
Yeah, that's amazing.
But you still can't, you can't get the academics to accept it.
Too many coincidences.
Well, absolutely.
You're stretching, David.
Oh, of course I am. Of course I am. Well, all I'm doing is looking at the evidence, the archaeological evidence, and making sense of it. And it can't be more sensible than that, because that's the story in the Bible. You don't have to have the name of Joseph on the statue somewhere to prove that.
And the thing is, too, is where you're agnostic. They can't say he's just some crazy Christian that's just trying to prove the Bible.
Yeah, they don't like that. The academics don't like that at all. And in a funny sort of way, neither do the evangelicals. So I'm stuck on this fence between the two sides. That's the problem. Some of them appreciate it because they say, well, okay, well, what David's done is brought to life the evidence that the stories in the Bible are true and they're not fantasy. And I hope they do appreciate that. But I don't deal with the miraculous because I'm not a theologian. I'm a dirt archaeologist. I can tell you what I think happened with the Exodus and the drowning of the army in the sea and all that sort of stuff. And I can understand the mechanisms might be understood by people to be the work of Yahweh, Yahuwah, whatever name you want to call him. And I think they did happen, these things. I think the walls of Jericho did fall down. I would attribute it to an earthquake. But then why shouldn't God use the things he created in nature for his miracles? The idea that somehow God creates the world and nature and all the things in nature, why wouldn't he use things like earthquakes and strong winds to blow back waters as these mechanisms for the miracles in the Old Testament?
No, I mean,
it's different to Jesus, of course. Jesus was a different thing. His miracles were very different to the Old Testament ones. They're much more humanistic, whereas in the Old Testament, they're more dynamic, much bigger events.
Well, what do you say to those that have I've heard also a theory that Joseph could be, I think it was Imhotep the second.
Imhotep, yeah.
And the builder of the pyramid of Djoser. That pit was a grain pit during the famine and things like that.
Well, the first thing is the timing's all wrong. I mean, the Zoser Step Pyramid and then later on the Great Pyramids of Giza, they were all in the Old Kingdom. That's before the time of Abraham. So how could you put Joseph before the time of Abraham? Abraham fits in terms of chronology, even in the conventional chronology, at the end of the Old Kingdom, the transition to the Middle Kingdom, in this thing we call the First Intermediate Period. That's when you would expect to find Abraham and the Sodom and Gomorrah story and all that stuff. So you can't put Joseph before him by 300 or 400 years. That's not going to make any sense at all. He has to be after Abraham. Okay, and the Step Pyramid is a tomb. That's what it is. It's nothing else. You can't talk about grain pits and grain storage when the solid structure of a pyramid is simply, there's nowhere to store it. If you're going to build grain storage, you made them out of mud brick, and that's what the time of the Middle Kingdom, that's what they are. In fact, we actually have grain stores in the time of the Middle Kingdom, which were probably the ones that Joseph ordered to be constructed, because because of the famine, he got all the grain brought into central government, to these storage units, so it could be distributed again after the time of plenty into the time of famine. And they're even named these grain pits. They're called the grain pits, or the storage granaries of a vizier called Anku, who seems to be Joseph. Now, that's his Egyptian name. Now, if you want me to go into that, it's quite complicated. But in the Bible, it says that the Egyptian name was given to Joseph by the Pharaoh. It's Zaphaneth Pa'anea. That's something that probably we didn't even notice in the Bible, but it actually gives his name there. Zatanef Pa'anea. Now, when you translate that into Egyptian, it's Zatanef Pa'anku. Okay, which means he who is called the one who lives. Why? Because when his father Jacob came down into Egypt, thinking his son was dead, he found he was the vizier of Egypt, and he was alive. So Pharaoh said, "What a great story! I'll call him the one who lives." Yeah. So the one who is called, he who is called, the one who lives. Zaphaneth Apanea in Hebrew, but in Egyptian, Zatanaf Pa'aneach, because Anku is actually pronounced Aneach in Egyptian. And these granaries that I told you about, which are in this period, are all called the granaries of Aneach or Anku. So there you have evidence again that they're named after Joseph in his Egyptian name.
And see, that's why I love talking to people like you. You got the brain power for it, because you hear things like that with Imhotep II, and they create this picture and this narrative, and it does to the lay person. You're like, oh man, yeah, that does look. But as soon as I heard about Avaris and I seen the depictions of this pyramid and the statue with the red hair, the coat of many colors, I was like, no, dude, this is it. This is it.
It's not. You can't just pick on one famous individual in history and say, "Oh, that's Joseph." Okay, because yes, Imhotep was a great architect, he was a great medical man as well, and everything. But there are people throughout history who are like that. But when you get the specifics of the Joseph story, and the archaeology fits together, and the storyline fits together, and the population is there in Avaris, and it is enslaved. Once it's enslaved, they eventually disappear, and we even have the 10th plague actually in the ground in the archaeology, because they find a load of dead bodies thrown into pits. Right before the entire population of the city disappears. So that's the 10th plague. That's the death of the firstborn. You know, so no other time in Egyptian history we find this, where the entire site is covered in shallow graves, where they literally toss the bodies into the ground on top of each other. Right, and now what the archaeologists say about that, Manfred Bitak being the primary director of the site, is that this is a plague of some sort, a dreadful plague, and everybody was thrown in here to stop contaminating the population that was still alive. And then within a few days, they're off, they're gone. The whole population disappears and the city's abandoned.
Yeah, because the Egyptian belief, you know what I mean, the body was sacred. You needed that for the next life, you know what I mean? So they were not going through the rites, and the Ba and the Ka couldn't unite.
No grave goods tossed in on top of each other. You know, the story's there in the archaeology. And if for some reason it didn't all fit together, then I wouldn't accept it. But the fact it does fit together so well with a biblical narrative means that you pile one piece of evidence on top of another piece of evidence and gradually get a picture in archaeology which matches the story in the Bible.
Yeah, it's just amazing. So with the Exodus, you know, they gather up the bones of Joseph and they leave. Who do you believe the Pharaoh of the Exodus was then, David?
Okay. Well, the Egyptians tell us themselves. There's a character called Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest who wrote the history of ancient Egypt. Unfortunately, his original narrative doesn't exist today. We only have what we call redactions. And then Josephus also writes a little bit where he says he's directly quoting from Manetho.
It's extremely Hellenized too.
Yes, exactly. So you don't know quite what's going on there. But in one particular point, and this is at the end of the 13th dynasty, okay, so this is the time when Avaris is vacated and all these dead bodies are in the pits. It says, in the time of Tutimeus, and now he's writing in Greek for the Greek audience because he's in the Ptolemaic period, the pharaohs are the Greeks then. Tutimeus in ancient Egyptian would be Dudimos. Okay, and he's one of the last kings of the 13th dynasty. And he said, in his time, God smote the Egyptians. Now, you don't find in Egyptian texts references to a single god like that. You say the gods did this, the gods did that, but God, in singular, there smote the Egyptians. What the heck's that all about? And then it says, people of obscure race invaded Egypt without striking a blow because there was no army to defend the country. So these hordes came in from the north. Where was the army? Well, it was all in the Red Sea, at the bottom of the Red Sea, wasn't it? There wasn't an Egyptian army to defend the country. They came in without striking a blow. They imprisoned and enslaved the Egyptians. They murdered this, that, and the other. And they dominated the country for nearly 2 centuries. Okay, that's God's punishment. If you want to think of a theological issue here, that's God's punishment for the Egyptians for enslaving the Israelites who had left just before that point when these invaders came in, because the army had just been drowned in the Red Sea. So again, it all fits together. So we actually have this text about Timaeus, the pharaoh, in whose time Egypt was basically destroyed and invaded. And then you have a papyrus as well, which talks about the river turning into blood. He who pours the water shall turn into blood. Well, in the biblical text, it says, he who pours the water, the river shall turn into blood. Okay, so, and it says that the slaves became the rich, that the Egyptians gave their treasures to the slaves as they left the country. You know, this is the biblical story of the Exodus, and it's all there in a papyrus called Papyrus Ipuwer. But of course, in the conventional dating scheme, Ipuwer's papyrus is way too early to be the story in the Bible of the Exodus because of the long chronology I've been talking about, the overextended chronology. So we had the evidence there. And then, you know, a few decades later on, Jericho was destroyed and abandoned for 600 years. And all the other cities of Canaan, the promised land, were destroyed at that time, just as in the story of the book of Joshua. Exactly the same story.
So with your revised timeline, does it change anything with the narrative of like Elephantine?
Elephantine, they call it Elephantine, is how it's pronounced. Okay, Elephantine.
I'm a Southern man. I can barely speak English.
Yeah, well, I know that. Yeah, you and your Shilohs instead of Shilohs, for instance, and all that sort of thing. Yeah, I know. Well, don't worry about it. That's fine. I don't mind that. As I said, we pronounced Ramesses' name completely wrong as well, and that's everybody. No, Elephantine is later. Okay, that's the time of Jeremiah. So we're dealing with the time really when the Assyrians had already taken over much of the Holy Land at this point, and Jeremiah and the others had fled down to Egypt, and some settled in the Delta, others moved down to Elephantine and Aswan. So this is where you get the documentation there, the Hebrew documentation there. So that's a much, much later period. But again, you know, you go into the later periods and you do find evidence there, and that's accepted by the Egyptologists and the historians. They're not worried about that. It's only when you get to the time of Solomon before they start to have issues. They're quite happy with Ahab and Omri and all those characters, Nebuchadnezzar's sack of Jerusalem, all that. It's all fine by them. But if you go any earlier than that, and they say now it's all fairy stories.
Man. That's just awesome. And speaking, you know, I can't speak for all of evangelicals, but for me, I definitely am appreciative that you've looked through and found these things and proven the Bible to be historic.
I'm glad about that because an agnostic is somebody who is searching for the truth, okay, biblical truth. And if anything, you know, when we go into such detail as we do, especially academics, and we produce evidence, it tells us the story is based on reality. Okay, so then you have to look at the theological elements that interweave with that historical story. But if you don't have a historical foundation, then the theology has nothing to hold on to. You have to have a physical history first that tells you what happened, and then you interpolate into that your religious belief system. Okay, so, but if you take away that foundation, you say it's all, just a myth, you know, a pious myth, none of it was reality, what they call a foundation myth, then you've got no foundation for your belief systems. And you can say, well, I don't need it, I've just got faith. But why not have faith with history and evidence? It's much more valuable. I always say to people, God gave you a brain. You have to use it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I tell people all the time, it's 1 Peter 3:15. You got to be able to give a reason for your faith and what you believe, and be able to defend it. And that's how I've always seen it. It's a foundation. It just gives you something sturdy to stand on. And sadly,
Absolutely.
there's so many Christians, good intended Christians, that just go to church on Sunday, believe what they're told, and it's just blind faith with no research to back it up and solidify it, honestly.
But it doesn't have to be blind. That's what I'm trying to say. It can be with eyes open. And the eyes open are archaeology. Archaeology and history is where the eyes are open. And then on top of that, you have the elements that God's interaction with those people that are historical characters. Yeah. And the same goes for the New Testament as well. I mean, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but as far as I'm concerned, the stories that we find out, in the Gospels are astonishingly interesting. They really are interesting. And the topography of Jerusalem, the location of the Temple of Solomon, the location of the crucifixion site, the tomb of Jesus, all those things we can look into as archaeologists, and we can elaborate and enlighten people on the reality of Jesus' life, especially those few days he spent in Jerusalem at the end of his life. And then even early Christianity and how that evolved into European Christianity. How did, for instance, did we get Christians in Rome for the first time when Paul hasn't even arrived yet? Because he writes to them and he says, "How are you all? I'm looking forward to seeing you. I'm coming to stay." And who are those Christians that are in Rome already before Paul? These are interesting questions that people don't even think about. Early Christianity is fascinating.
And I heard you on another podcast, and you were talking about the Holy Grail.
Oh, yes.
And that was such a good episode. But you were talking about how Joseph of Arimathea, basically, he was a merchant, so he had money, and he took a lot of the followers, and I think and chartered out and went out to Europe, and how you traced all these steps, and even how you were finding timestamps and artifacts and placing them and the Holy Grail in Rome. And I remember you said that they had dug up a small chapel or a house close to the Roman Colosseum.
It's not a small chapel and a house. It was a palace.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you a little story about that. It's a long one, but I'll keep it short, right? And
hey guys, if you enjoyed that preview and want to watch or listen to the rest of that episode, head on over to PrometheusLensPodcast.com and sign up for the All Access Pass. For $10 a month, you can help sponsor the show and gain access to a library of shows just like this one that's exclusive to those who help sponsor the show. You also get 48-hour early access to all future episodes, access to a private community, and monthly members chats and Q&As with authors and speakers that's been on the show. We also offer a $5 a month package that gets you everything that the All Access Pass gives, except for the exclusive episodes. If you enjoy the content, help us keep the lights on. This is your way of sponsoring the show and be like so many others that have come and joined me on the hero's journey.
Hi, my name is Mike, and I'm in beautiful downtown Boise, Idaho. I'm doing a morning walk and taking you with me as I try to explain why I became a member of the Prometheus Lens exclusive membership area. I mean, I am so blessed to be able to listen to some of the awesome presenters and speakers and content that Justin is providing in the Prometheus Lens podcast. It's incredible. I mean, these are top-notch guys with really, really interesting and well-researched ideas. And, honestly, as we live in what I like to call the world of the grand conspiracy, We all need this information. We need to know what to do with it. We're all having to deal with the impact of what this grand conspiracy has done to our world. And so, as you start to figure this stuff out, that these things are actually going on, and they're actually real, it changes. It changes your perspective, and you want that information to better equip yourself and your family and your friends. So, for less than the cost of 2 Whoppers from Burger King a month, you can join the Prometheus Lens exclusive membership on Supercast. And you can have access to all the exclusive content, plus get early release on the regular podcast. And you'll enjoy it, and you'll be blessed. And then you can share that information with others. And by doing so, you're helping Justin produce these time-consuming and financially costly productions. And he's doing an awesome job. And you know what I like probably more than anything? Is Justin is just a normal guy. You can tell he's genuine. He's doing it because he feels called to it. He has a passion for it. And something about that drive encourages me to just throw a few bucks his way. If he was here, maybe I'd just buy him coffees once in a while. But he's a good guy. So Justin, keep it up. Thank you for what you're doing. Everybody else, it's time to pony up, man. Feed a few bucks in the can. Buy a guy a couple Whoppers. And have a blessed day. Torches high.